We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Scott DeCosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor. Earlier in the show, we are doing a roundup of the biggest cases of 2023 as the year draws to a close. And we determined, both of us, I think we had some nice congruency there, that the death of affirmative action was probably the most significant and possibly the most interesting. But I know there are some very, very interesting ones still remaining in your Santa's bag of tricks. No, it's presents, isn't it? It's not tricks. Maybe that was just in my household when I was growing up.
That's funny. The 303 Creative case was the follow-on from the sort of Gay Baker case or Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And in Masterpiece Cake Shop, a group decided that a baker who was a traditionally and conservatively Christian religious man, they wanted him to be forced to bake a cake celebrating a gay wedding. That case had a kind of tortured procedural history, which is why that led to the 303 Creative case, which was the case of a woman. This is from Colorado, where the Masterpiece Cake Shop case was also from. And Colorado had basically gone after these conservatives and said, not only do you have to do what we say, but you're going to like it or else. And they said, what about my religious rights and my free speech rights to basically practice my religion as I see fit and not have compelled speech. So this woman wanted to design websites only for weddings that she felt celebrated marriage in a way that was consistent with God's will under her interpretation of that. She didn't want to go ahead and celebrate same-sex weddings with the creation of websites for those customers. So she sued to say, is that okay? Or am I going to have to basically forfeit and be bankrupt because of my preferences? So this really dialed back all of the cry bullies who, wanted to stomp into conservative Christians' businesses and bring them under heel.
Were the justices' thoughts on this then? What did they determine in the end?
Oh, Mark, this is the dividend of the Trump presidency for those of us who favor limited government, which is to say that the court now's majority often favors limited government, did so in this case. They said that even though those of us that are really on team limited government wanted a First Amendment win based on religion and speech, it came out as just for the compelled speech aspect of it. But in any case, it's a good decision for liberty, I think. Anytime that the people get to, decide for themselves how to speak and be, and there's less involvement for the government in those matters, I think is a big win.
It's something that gets so often overlooked is your ability to speak freely reflects directly your ability to think. And when people are compelling speech, they're not just telling you what to say in any given situation, that they're essentially torturing your mind into a position where you have to think right. And we have seen cases where people are being prosecuted for wrong think in the UK. And so much so that there's a meme where, hello, sir, the policeman comes around to the house, I've come to check your thinking. And it's a troublesome thing, and it's great, I think, that the Supreme Court has given a free speech win. What else is on your list?
Troublesome doesn't begin to describe what you just said. I wish more Americans would think about it more often. It is, I got the goosebumps right now just thinking, Western societies where police come by to investigate the things that you said. And you are so right. To say that you can't say something is to say that you can't think it. That's why they do it. And that's why we have to resist it.
Very, very much so. It's possibly the most important fight that our generation, or of any localized generation to this point in time, is facing, is the ability to be able to think what you want to think, whether that's right or wrong. Because that's what being human is. It's your ability to think separately. We're not ants. There's a slightly off topic. There's the Once and Future King books, where I believe it's the third book in that series about King Arthur and Merlin, where he, slightly off topic here, but he becomes various animals to learn how they think, so he can become a good king later on, at courtesy of Merlin's magic. And at one point, he becomes an ant, and ants operate in a collective thing where they all think the same. And it's it's actually quite a damning indictment of an almost forced communism for a book that is well worth a read for anybody who's not read it.
Okay.
So, what else do we have in your Christmas sack, Santa di Cosenza?
As it was the Sackett versus EPA decision, Mark, which really dialed back the level of regulation the EPA is able to offer. It was what happens often is the Congress will pass a law that says we want to have clean air, or clean water, or clean something, and then authorizes the EPA to draft regulations consistent with that law. And then the EPA interprets those regulations to mean something else. So usually the law passed is fairly narrow, and then that's expanded by the regulations, and then the interpretation of the regulations expands beyond that. And so this ruling pared all that back to say that the interpretation and the rulings were far outside the authorizing law.
Scott, if you could explain this to me, because it seems to me that the Sackett versus EPA case, that must have some bearing on the upcoming Chevron deference case in the courts, doesn't it?
Well, Mark, the case that just happened with the Sackett versus EPA consisted of one particular regulation, the regulation of wetlands,
Right.
and whether or not the EPA could regulate them based on the authorizing law. The upcoming case regarding the Chevron deference, which is Loper Bright Enterprises, concerns whether or not the way the federal government operates as a matter, or whether how the courts treat the federal government in their courtrooms.
Okay.
Which is to say they give deference to federal government understanding of regulations that the federal government themselves drafted, right? So EPA, for instance, in the Sackett case, it would be if the EPA drafted some other regulations and they go to court and they say, we think the regulation should mean X. In this case, courts may say, okay, well, you're the experts, you're the EPA. Well, there are plenty of those of us who say, no, the courts are independent and are charged with maintaining that independence through their own judgment and not deferring to agencies. And also, if you were going to have them defer to anybody, let's let them defer to the citizens. In other words, if a regulation, for instance, or law clearly doesn't negatively impact a person's rights or property, wouldn't we say that it's incumbent on the government to get their ducks in a row to pass something that does before taking away from the citizen?
So the deference case that will be, I guess that'll be decided in 2024. That will determine how the application of these various government agencies, all government agencies, in fact, is played out, and whether there will be more people's voices on it. I guess because that's if the justices rule against the deference being standing law, that means that they have to find another way, and that way kind of has to involve either the people or the people's representatives to craft the certain laws. Is that right?
This is a judge-made rule. The Chevron deference refers to this case, decades ago, and
Called Chevron.
it's just a rule where the Supreme Court says that they, and then therefore the courts that are under them, will give this deference. So all that's required for them to make a sea change in this area is to remove the deference, to say we are no longer going to extend this deference to the administration.
And then the whole of the federal government has to reorganize itself. That'll be a fun thing to come. Now, speaking of stories to come, cases to come, Scott, I always think in terms of stories, obviously, because I write. So the thing of stories to come, but these are actual cases to come. What's coming down the pipeline in 2024? What's the case that you're looking forward to covering the most on the pages of libertynation.com?
Well, certainly Loper Bright Enterprises, which is the Chevron deference, is competing up there for number one. Another one is the Rahimi case, which I attended arguments for on behalf of libertynation.com. The first time I did sit in for the full argument in the press area. So for kind of sentimental reasons, I think that's interesting, but also for the legal implications. That's why I actually had been following the case and wanted to attend the arguments. That case concerns whether or not the Congress could kind of loop in a penalty that takes away people's gun rights if they are subject to a domestic violence restraining order. And a lot of the litigation around guns lately, around the margins, has to do with when you can take people's guns away regarding actions in the civil courts rather than in the criminal courts. And so that I think is a fascinating case that will tell us a lot about gun rights cases going forward with the current composition of this court.
Well, I think on top of the Bruen decision in 2022, I think a lot of people who respect gun rights and want the Second Amendment to be clearly articulated are keeping a very, very close eye on this case. Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much for your Liberty Roundup, let's call it, our Talking Liberty Roundup. Much appreciated.
Happy New Year, Mark.
Happy New Year to you. And that's about all we have time for on this week's special edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd just like to take a moment to say thank you to our special guests, Tim Donner and Scott DeCosenza, and of course, you, the listeners at home. Thank you for tuning in and wishing you a very, very prosperous and happy New Year's. Take care.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.